are we witnessing the end of neoliberalism? And if so, what are the prospects and priorities for a future post-neoliberal political project? Paul, going to start over with you. You've really set the context for this discussion in the first essay that you've written, which is going to be a series for Open Democracy exploring what radical social democracy means over the next 10 years. Why do you think that this is the discussion that we ought to be having at the moment?
Well, when I call myself a radical social democrat, it seems to wind up people in the centre of the Labour Party, because their belief is that that's an impossibility. But we're going to have radical social democracy because we're going to have to run capitalism. We're going to have to take control of the state. Those are two things that social democracy has always committed working class parties to doing, as opposed to overthrow capitalism and smash the state, which we're not going to do. But we're going to do it in a different way because the existing model is broken. And when something's broken, and you've got, unlike the 1930s, no section of the elite whatever prepared to rethink it, it then falls to parties outside the mainstream to make that radical move. And that's what I mean by radical social democracy. Now, that project has, I think, two urgent things to do. It has to come up with more than a series of palliative measures. For example, fiscal redistribution is a measure that can mitigate poverty. But where does poverty come from? Or what do we do about quantitative easing in the long term? Well, why did we need it? Because the banking system was broken. So you go beyond palliative measures towards finding a new dynamo of accumulation. That's the first thing. The second thing is, in the British context, we're quite lucky. We've got 40% of people who consistently tell opinion pollsters they want a radical left Labour government. That's good. But there's another 40% who are quite happy to have a fairly radically right-wing nationalist conservative government, and therefore to win, we've got to punch across the 50% mark. And for me, what I thought the Labour manifesto in June 2017 was brilliant, but what it didn't clearly do, it didn't punch into that, I don't call it the centre ground, it's just a ground in a demographic area in British politics that is not yet switched on to, as it were, Keynesian state intervention. So we need to give them something even more imaginative and something to buy into. And that's why in this first essay what I've done is focus on the issue of social mobility.
And just bringing in Faiza at this point, there was an interesting, stunning victory earlier this week, actually, I think it was in Germany, by the biggest trade union there, which won the right, I think it was to the right to a 28-hour week and a 4.3% pay rise, which in the context of Britain just seems almost, fantasy land. People, you say that and it just sounds almost utopian. Paul touches on the point about social mobility. Have we just forgotten what it feels like to go forwards rather than backwards here in Britain? Have we forgotten what progress feels like, do you think?
Yeah, I think we have forgotten what progress feels like, but we haven't forgotten that we should have progress. A lot of people feel, they're asking those questions about why is my 30-year-old still at home? Why is it that my kids have done all the right things and still have all of this debt and finding it very hard to live their own lives and stand on their own 2 feet. This point about social mobility, though, I think it's quite tricky because the way in which it's been framed for the last 30 years is very individualized, it's essentially a con. It's basically saying, as long as some of you working class people or people of colour, what have you, can get to the top, then the system is fine. That's all we need to fix. Never mind that system where those rungs are getting further and further apart makes it harder and harder for people to be socially mobile. And in any case, all you're arguing for there is to equalise misery. All you're saying is, as long as some people get out, then that's fine. It doesn't matter if we have some people that are, finding it very, very difficult. As long as that's equal amongst certain groups, equality groups, then that's all we're aiming for, which to me is not visionary at all and is not progressive.
Johnna, Faiza mentioned debt there, and one of the key pillars of neoliberal capitalism in Britain, at least, has been the finance-led growth and the financialisation of different parts of our life and our society. What impact do you think that has had on this issue of social mobility in Britain, and what sort of challenges do you think that poses when we're thinking about how to kind of get back that issue of social mobility on the agenda going forward?
Well, I think when we talk about things like the growing inequality that's happening, that's driving a lot of the political instability, people are very comfortable to talk about it in terms of, well, income inequality, that how much you earn relative to others, or wealth inequality, how much housing wealth has changed the nature of the economy. But really what's lurking in the background there is the way in which debt is driving these inequalities in really profound ways that aren't talked about publicly. The private debt accumulation in this country is a strategic silence, where politicians are really comfortable banging on about the public debt. Is it growing too fast, too slow, how much? They will not discuss private debt because this is seen as an individualized problem. This is really about prudent financial management. Well, if it is an individual problem, it's an individual problem that's shared by huge swathes of the population, and that are also concentrated amongst the young, amongst urban, the urban young. And these kind of populations of indebted are growing year on year, of people who really struggle. And the way in which debt is changing inequality, for example, when we look at why people go into debt, typically it's for a one-off emergency. Someone's been made redundant, or someone's had a heart attack or gotten cancer and become ill and had to withdraw from the workforce. So instead of having social security to rely on in these times of need, people borrow against their home, or they get a loan out. Well, this reconfigures what we mean by temporary interruption of employment, because if when you do go back to work and you find a job, that income is not your route out of poverty or out of financial peril. You have to continue to pay off the debt that you borrowed just to make the bills when you were unemployed. Now, this creates a huge lag effect in which people can't overcome just even temporary interruptions in employment, or being made redundant, or having a heart attack. The debt that they take on at that time then carries on for years and years and years, and they can't get out of it. And I think that's that kind of financial precarity that people have at an individual level is actually expressed at the national level in this kind of economic malaise that has set in Britain that we just can't break out of, because we have a debtor's mentality. We're just struggling to make the GDP forecast for this quarter and the national income measures for this quarter, just as individuals are struggling to make their bills at the end of the month. And so to revitalize social mobility is really about revitalizing the economy, and tackling the private debt problem is really crucial to that.
Anthony, just bring you in at this point. In Paul's essay, he makes the comparison to your dad's generation, the kind of post-war era, where the changes that people witnessed in terms of going through higher incomes, the quality of life improving under the kind of Attlee government and going forward, and drawing some parallels. Do you think that is the kind of the right juncture to be looking at in reference to where we are today?
Well, in a word, no. I think that when Paul said there was a double crisis going on, there's both a breakdown of the economic system and of the sort of neoliberal model, but also of the political system, of complete failure by the elite of political imagination. And I think that breakdown of the state is something which, in quite complicated ways, people have absorbed. So I think the Brexit vote wasn't about economics. And that's why, it's very clear that the economic argument against Brexit won. It won the economic argument. And most people, a very large majority of those who voted for Remain, said they did so for economic reasons. And the people that voted for Brexit voted because they just didn't like the way we were governed. They did not want to be governed by these sort of bureaucrats. And therefore, there was a quite deep rejection of the way we're ruled. And that's why the simple Remain argument, let's go back to how it was, simply doesn't wash. We've got to address that. So there's an issue which is greater than the issue of the economic crisis. And my feeling in terms of where we're at is that I think we're much closer to heading into a sort of 1983 election than a 1945 one. That's to say, I think that the crisis now, the economic breakdown, is much closer to that of the 1970s. Mm-hmm. And the Conservatives are going to try to play Brexit as a Falklands, Britain alone. They're going to try and play that patriotic card as their way out of a political, economic, sort of breakdown that is taking place. And the problem of trying to, and therefore I don't think Labour is going to be able to replay the brilliant 2017 election of just saying, well, we accept the outcome of Brexit and we'll carry on and we will produce a better economic outcome.
I mean, to come back on that, one of the reasons I'm keen not to frame this all around Brexit is because my experience of the 2017 election was that, having prepared myself to talk about Brexit on the doorstep, nobody wanted to talk about it. They wanted to talk about, when's my road going to be fixed? What about the local school? And that's what I think managed to repair Labour's slightly broken relationship to its own voting base. But where I think you're right is that economics doesn't solve right-wing populism. Economics does not cure it or mitigate it on its own. And in fact, it was the left that once had this slogan, we don't want to live in an economy. You remember that? The Scottish nationalists, in fact, were using that against the economic arguments on Scottish independence.
Not our GDP.
Exactly. Yeah. And who does? None of us lives in an economy. So the purpose of focusing on, and and it's a stage by stage thing. The first thing is to ask yourself, what would bring not only the promise of, but the quite swift realization of sort of 1945, 1965 style mobility in both the general sort of well-being, wage levels, productivity, and yes, the mobility. Because for me, for my dad's generation, social mobility, well, it wasn't invented. It becomes a debate in the late 50s once the elite discovered the possibility that meritocracy might oust them. Okay, but for my dad's generation, what really made them love the post-war world was that their real wages rose, their real housing costs fell, and the quality and availability of services really radically changed. And the point was, in your lifetime. Now, but if you look at the other end of this, by the time the British Social Mobility Commission disbanded, Alan Milburn just gives up and he says, nobody's interested in this, it's dire. What had been achieved? Well, what's been achieved is we've now got a postcode social stagnation. That's what he recorded, and that's terrible. But then, if you look at their metrics, the Social Mobility Commission, as they gave up, it was, out of 16 metrics, 10 are what happens to children at school. So what does that mean? It means that they're now defining social mobility as, how do your kids get out of the shit situation that you're in? Whereas for my dad's generation, it was, my wages are going to rise next year. My house is going to, fall. The housing cost of servicing the mortgage is going to fall. How amazing! How do we rekindle that? For me, is an important question. For the reason that you, Anthony, identify, that then we in Britain, and I hope the German Social Democrats and the Italian Social Democrats, have a story to tell that middle bit, who are insecure, who do think, oh my goodness, if one thing goes wrong with me, I'm down there with the benefit claimants, who I don't like, who I would rather not think about. So we have to win elections, it's one thing that Tony Blair understood, you've got to tell a story to I hate the word aspirational, because my dad wasn't aspirational in this sense. He thought it was his right to have a quality of life. He was almost like, without knowing it, an Aristotelian. He believed in the good life as a right, not an aspiration.
Faiza, on the term social mobility, Paul, in your piece you say that it's become a bit of a dirty word on parts of the left, and a code word for, as you said, the aspirational voter, someone who wants to escape poverty by stabbing everyone else in the back. Do you think that the term social mobility is useful, or does it have issues? Does it have ingrained in the term the sort of a class ladder, if you like?
Yeah, I think what's happened, because it's been used so well by the right, and even recently we've heard Theresa May talk a lot about the British dream. Look, the idea of the American dream, social mobility, British dream, it's had so much propaganda. It's like the ultimate feel-good story, rags to riches, and how we go from a world where Drake's lyrics on "Made it from the bottom, now I'm here," and that's like the ultimate thing you can achieve in their life, to this idea that your whole community can be lifted up at the same time, I think people have lost faith in that happening. So I think you're right. There's a story to be told. We have to rebuild that sense of possibility. And I think we've failed to do that in terms of a vision for this country for a very long time. I heard someone say recently about, Kennedy used to talk about putting a man on the moon that made, that put something out there for us. What are we going to say? What is the thing that people get behind? Social mobility is such an easy one. People only understand that term right now as, someone gets out, I get out. So to redefine that will take some time, and we'll have to think carefully about how we retell that story, perhaps with different terms.
Can I just come in? However, the great opportunity is, even as defined by that, the Tories have lost that as a story because it isn't happening. Because of what you say, in terms of you've got rising inequalities of wealth, stagnation of incomes, and then frustration of how do my kids get on? How do they get a house? How do they, you can even get to Oxford, I discovered last night. You can even get to Oxford, and the first thing you find out as a working class kid is you've got no chance whatsoever of matching the outcomes of the public school people who have turned up alongside you. It's in other words, it's even in your face when you've got into the top university in the country that there is a glass ceiling after glass ceiling. So, sorry for interrupting, but I was just trying to say, I think there's a major opportunity for us to seize that ground without having to necessarily spend a long time academically redefining it. We can do that as well.
I don't think it's an academic project. I think you're right. I think it's a storytelling project and a visionary project. And then you underneath that have the policies that would deliver that, that world.
You see, you're saying social mobility is still seen as a route of escape rather than a route of solidarity and improvement.
And that's the rising tide lifts all boats sort of logic of social security and the larger...
It's a lottery version, isn't
yes,
it?
Exactly.
They'll win the lottery and that will escape the...
Yeah, and the real antidote to the kind of idea of the kind of aspirational NIMBYs, as it were, is that really people want quite modest things. The ask of politics at this moment is not for great revolution or upheaval. It is, like you say, the mundane acts in everyday life of, can I have a train that isn't packed to the rafters and 20 minutes late? Can my kids go to a school where the teacher has enough time to actually give lessons to a reasonable number of children? These are quite small asks, but it is the grinding down of kind of basic social provision, I think, that fosters a lot of unhappiness, because again, the average family in Britain who's just going to work, sending their kids to school, seeing their friends at the weekend, I mean, they have seen a real decline in their standard of living. And we do want to imagine, I think, a generation that had it all. But we also have to look, when we look at debt figures, for example, how many retired old age pensioners are taking home equity loans? And we look at the Tory government and their proposals for how are we going to fund social care. We'll give you a loan on the total value of your house, so you'll be cared for in old age, but you will give nothing to your family.
Can I just, because I don't think that people just want modest improvements like trains, that public services that are basic, because I think there's a deep anger. There's a rage at what has happened, and so the political expression. That's why, I hope Paul's argument. I fear for it will work, because I think the other side of that argument is xenophobia and diverting that rage into very right-wing populist forms, and the drive behind that is a collapse in trust in the system.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
No, I agree.
And that is more than I want a modest trade. People want to be. I think part of. So when it comes to the Brexit vote, just say, I'm not for centering on. I would like to get Brexit out the way, right? But I do think that the democratic argument, right? How do we govern ourselves? How can we have a government we trust? How can we get back control? That element is a very, very powerful and new force in this country.
Looking ahead now, so in your essay, Paul, you said that Labour under Attlee was able to transform capitalism because they understood what they needed to do, who they needed to do it for, in what order, what the risks were, and how to overcome the resistance. So if we just start with the what to begin with, what fundamentally, concisely, in your view, do you think are the key pillars really for a political project, radical social democracy, so over the next 10 years, that's looking to make a decisive break with neoliberalism?
Well, let me just kind of frame the answer by saying, of course, what happened before Labour won the 1945 general election was that the world system in which they would implement the Beveridge Report and the NHS and the nationalisation plan had actually been pre-designed at Bretton Woods by Keynes and Harry Dexter White. And Keynes and White sat down in 1941 when Britain was losing the war and said, what's the world going to look like when we win? So that inspires me towards a sort of intellectual endeavour. So many people on the left, you go and speak at a university, and what they expect you to say is, go on picket lines. But what I always say to them is, read some books and help us come up, like the Keynes generation and Beveridge generation did, with a new design for a capitalism that works. Now, if Labour were to bring down the Tories at the end of this year, I think that's possible. They'll be the first radical left government in a major country, but there'll be no Bretton Woods. So that's the frame. Nobody has pre-designed what the monetary, in fact there is a pre-existing system of neoliberalism, the IMF, World Bank, OECD, blah blah blah. ECB, we're still in Europe, Commission that we have to deal with, and therefore I think that you'll have to go for a score draw in the conflict that you'll come up with against some of them. But the what is, the first part of it is the bold fiscal measures that Corbyn and MacDonald proposed in June 2017. That is about 50 billion worth of tax on the rich and large corporations to immediately inject hope, possibility, transformation into the lives of targeted people like all students, who in the future, and all teachers and all health workers. These are large numbers of people you can immediately deliver to. Because in my essay, might have got lost, I'm saying you lift the cap on, there's a really virtuous thing in lifting the cap on public sector pay, because then the public sector sets norms of behaviour and standards for the private sector. Then Starbucks has to think, then private health contractors have to think, what are we going to pay? So the what is, I think it comes down to almost like a sort of, I'm trying to make it really simple as well, because we've all got to push at the same outcome. It's how do adults of working age see in their lifetime an immediate and rapid uptick of their real wages, a fall in their housing cost, and a rising quality of services, and then the concomitant of that is, how do towns that have stagnated and been left behind and look terrible revive? And I think for that, it's the other part of the fiscal offer. That is the 250 billion borrowing with a national investment bank, with all kinds of micro-level delivery mechanisms, whether it's a funded cooperative bank, whether it's a local state investment bank, whatever it is, you give control to the communities of what they want that money to be spent on, but you almost, as Baldwin's government actually did in the 30s, as the immediate post-war government did, you target the devastated areas. And I imagine it's like a swoosh starting around about Telford, going out into sort of the Welsh border, into Wales, and going up, Middle England towards Tyneside. That's where it is. And you say, I'm sorry everybody else, that's where the pain in British society is. Small towns that've got very little social capital going on for them. People want to leave them. They can't all leave them. Let's put them right. And that just so happens to be the exact swoosh of marginal constituencies that Labour needs to win. And it also is more or less the exact heartland of working class Brexit voters.
Faiza, in terms of what should be at the heart of an economic programme over the next 10 years, what do you think in terms of, so Paul's outlined the kind of tax rises, investment, which Labour are already proposing. Do you think Is that going to be enough, do you think, necessarily to bring about the kind of change that we've been talking about? Is that, I mean, what else do you see as being critical here in order to get in?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fundamental start. And like, as been said, we have this horrible relationship with debt right now, especially public debt. We've got this thing in our heads about, public debt is something that we should be completely focused on, and that should be the ultimate aim of government, to lower that. And so that shift, and that's the big thing for Labour getting in as well, is people still think, oh, but we can't afford it. I mean, that's a big job that needs to be done before whenever the next election is. But it's a start, and the reason it's a start is because the things we're talking about here, we have all of these issues to deal with, but we also have demographic change, technological change, climate change, all that are making these types of investments. And I agree with Paul, across the country, really fundamental in recalibrating the economy. But there's another job we have to do at the same time, which is your point about trust, how we rebuild trust, how we rewrite rules, how we make sure there's grassroots ownership of new energy companies, renewable energy companies, for instance. And so, this is a huge project because there's a lot to fix at the same time. And, you're right, it's political institutions and trust, it's the economics, it's also, people's opinions of immigrants and, some of the ways in which the ugly kind of xenophobic, racist views have surfaced, which aren't all just economics. Those are things that are left over from the empire or what have you. And, that's something we have to confront at the same time, that British identity question. There's a huge amount to be done, but we can start taking steps towards those, and certainly investment, in terms coming from an economist, is key to giving people back that hope.
Johnna, we're sort of outlining here, in a sense, a shift. Fundamentally, in the UK economy has been consumption-led, debt-driven a lot of the time. A shift to more investment-led type of economy. Do you think? We've had a finance-led economy for a very long time, oriented around the City of London. Do you think that having more public investment, whether it's through state investment banks, whether it's through local banks or anything else, is that going to make a fundamental break with a kind of financialised capitalism? Or does something need to go alongside that, for example, with the City of London or other institutions, in order to kind of make that fundamental break?
Well, I think it's two things, really. I mean, the investment bank and the kind of idea of kind of a more productionist model where we're investing in economic growth is good in and of itself, but I do believe it's limited. And I think because what we need to overcome from the kind of past generation of social mobility is a kind of productionist-based model where we're focusing on the production of things, the trade of things across borders. And we need to start looking at the care and reproduction of people, taking care of society. And this is the work that's being done in feminist economics, to talk about how we have a crisis of care. We have an elderly, aging population that are largely cared for by immigrant women that will, if Brexit is hard, be expelled. And how are we going to fix that problem? The care of young children, in nurseries and the childcare problems that we have in terms of supporting the labor market. We need to think about how are we going to care for society, and how is society going to be cared for, who's going to do that, and how are they going to be provisioned for. We don't live in a world where, nor do we want to live in a world where we just say, well, women, it's your job to stay in the private sphere unpaid and caring for society. Those days are gone. And therefore, if we continue down to revive this male breadwinner model of productionist-based investment and ignore the care of society, I think that we'll just end up in a different quagmire. And what financialization has done well, precisely in tapping in that kind of aspirational model, is to provide huge segments of population with capital that they wouldn't have otherwise done, as long as they promise to pay 25% of their income well into their working years to sustain that. So I think investing in people and care is really an important conversation that needs to be integrated into a kind of new economic model if we are going to move past a kind of finance-driven, debt-driven growth.
Anthony, just to bring you in here, you have written, indeed in your book as well, that talking about shifting or shifts in economic hegemony of the kind that we are potentially talking about here, kind of break with neoliberalism, is often in the past been accompanied by a kind of reconfiguration of Britain's role in the world, if you like, that this doesn't happen on its own, and in terms of who we are and our place in the
Right.
world. How do you see that fitting in this context right now? You talked about how that happened with Thatcher, for example, you talked about. Do you see that as being has to be part of the same project, if we're talking about an incoming Labour government, for example, of that reimagining of Britain's role in the world? Do you see that being
I think any radical project, and I think that the type that's being described here of a human-centered, caring economy that is based on improving people's lives and is therefore governed as such, and that's an enormous transformation from what we have. That has to be accompanied by what kind of people are we and how we are governed, and if it isn't, then the xenophobia, the using of migration, as a kind of as the counter to that. You've got to be able to take on the need to govern immigration in a positive fashion, including being able to leave hundreds of thousands of people leave the country every year. People talk about migration as if it's sort of some invasion just coming in. So you've got to be able to talk positively about that, and that means talking about what kind of country we are. And I think the danger here is that my fear is that this question is one that the Tories, though they're arguing over it, are much more sensitive to at the moment than Labour. Labour is hoping that, so if you take what Paul said, perhaps just sort of slipping it out, there's the hope, I think Labour has the hope, that there'll be an election this year, a crisis, some parliamentary crisis. They'll force an election and then they can win on a equivalent to sort of 2017 plus. And I think this is very unlikely. It's possible that will happen, but it's more likely that they will get, because the Europeans want to just get a deal of some sort, that there'll be a Brexit deal which the Tories in a relatively united way will play a Falklands card. Will play, this is a rallying to that. And then if that doesn't happen and they manage to get a deal with Europe, they could carry on for another 4 years. And it's not clear to me, if they do that, where this argument gets to. So I think you've got to plan an argument of this radicalism on the other side being not doing what you wish, right? And thinking, well, now if they play their cards really well, we've got to be better than that. And that was one thing, because Paul mentioned what Blair did, is that even though it was absolutely clear from 1993, from Black Wednesday onwards, that the major government was heading for defeat, he upped, he upped the ante. The New Labour was ferocious in trying to seize more agenda, being more positive. It didn't wait for the collapse. And there's a sense at the moment that Labour are just waiting to see the Tories crumble, that they're playing to their divisions rather than saying, even if they're united, this is our answer if they're united. And so you've got to think, how will they unite themselves? How could they do that? Around what programme would they do that? And what would be Labour's answer to that?
I mean, I do think on a week-to-week basis, whether it's Carillion, whether it's the NHS staff, Labour is trying to offer something different. And so they are coming back on particular issues. So they're saying this model is broken, and we're hearing that from Corbyn. And they're very, they're not just talking about tiny parts, that they are so structurally the economy doesn't work anymore. So that is coming out. But you're right, maybe we're not thinking enough about the way Brexit could be used positively. I mean, although if Labour is going to say they're doing Brexit too, then how far can they play the Falklands card? I mean, because if Labour is saying, well, we'd effectively do it too.
Michael Foot said he could have done a better invasion of the Falklands, and it didn't work.
It
just didn't work.
But to me, the reason why I'm determined not to let either the possibility of the overthrow or the possibility, as you say, that they get a deal and then they sell it, skew the bigger question is that neoliberalism is still broken. That's the issue. Now, for me, the Tory hard Brexit is national neoliberalism. Trump is national neoliberalism. The AfD's program in Germany is, and now increasingly the program of the CSU, the Catholic Bavarian wing of Merkel's coalition, is national neoliberalism. Now, what does that mean? Is rip up your international obligations, beggar your neighbour, as in the 1930s. And I think that what we need to be able to say is that, in other words, people think, because when you meet a working class Tory, what they often say is, because the Daily Mail and the BBC have told them this again and again, Theresa May cares about the working class. And actually they mean it in a way that David Cameron and his toffee-nosed cabinet didn't. No, that's just simply not true. Theresa May's cabinet is full of people who want to rip up labour protections, rip up environmental protections, turn Britain into a kind of gas-guzzling, lead-polluted wasteland if they could get away with it. But people don't realise this. So part of the art of winning is to create the expectation of greater social justice. And I think Labour has done that. And when they actually hear what Boris Johnson and Rees-Mogg actually want to do with wages, conditions, on this agenda, and of course expel all the migrants at the same time, I think for me, this is only going to end with a series of dramatic moments, the situation. It cannot unravel it also can't de-escalate, if you see what I mean. Everyone has to escalate their offer until there is a crisis point. That's how we're going to get out of this situation.
I don't see as well with the Brexit thing, even if they get a deal with the EU, it's not as if those places that voted for Brexit, their lives are going to feel a lot better. I think they will, it's not as if, economically there's going to be more economic justice in the meantime. So the argument that Labour can deliver more economic and social justice will still be there and still be obvious, because the NHS is not exactly going to get huge amounts of investment in the next few years.
And I think it's also important to give voice and articulate the degree to which the state and the public funding under the Tories has been absolutely to just turn the tap of public money and pour it into the banks, and to basically, like Carillion and like Capita and the large companies, these are the great herbivore capitalists. They just eat thousands of pounds of government contracts every month, and that is all they survive on. And these are the elite now. That I think it's important to tell the voters that your taxes will not go down. They will go up, and you will continue to fund the abject failure of banks, corporations, time and time again. They will reach in your pocket to bail themselves out, that we will privatize all the profits and socialize all the losses on everyone else, because that's what's happening. And nobody's giving that sustained voice to say, wait a second, should the Bank of England continuously be fictionally creating more and more government debt that we all are underwriting in order to continuously bail out the banks? Because it has been ongoing for 10 years. There was, first the bailouts, then the guarantees, and now just plain government contracts being created and given to the banks that we're all underwriting. And to ask the question, is that really what the state is for? Does the state exist to underwrite the wealthy, to make sure that they stay profitable, and the rest of us are just meant to pay for it? And if there's not enough money, we can't afford it. I mean, nobody ever said we couldn't afford quantitative easing.
If we think about, there's a radical economic programme, I think with elements of it discussed here. If we think about the how, though, coming up with the what is one thing, but thinking about the how, and Paul, you identified already that, in your view, there's two areas which have yet to be appealed to or punched through. One being the kind of left behind impoverished. You mentioned people like your dad, for example. Similarly, the kind of professionals who vote maybe Lib Dem Tory, as well as that problem, there's hostility in the media and financial markets, etc. How can these various tensions, do you think, be overcome, brought together, united around a radical economic programme that has enough support to take it over the line in terms of a general election?
Well, I think it's going to be done around a story. It's not around lots of people loved Labour's manifesto. I loved the fiscal content of it. I didn't love the 20,000 words of stuff, because there was a lot for everybody, but the story wasn't properly told, I don't think. And I think I would say the story is the massive amount of borrowing and spending. We're going to borrow a lot of money, and we will have won the argument, even with the Institute for Fiscal Studies that hates Labour's methodology. They cannot argue against investment for borrowing for investment. Only the crazy Institute for Economic Affairs, shadily funded, we don't know by whom, continues to insist that borrowing to grow is impossible. If that were true, capitalism wouldn't exist. Businesses could not do it. But it's true. So I think the borrow and spend is the basis of the story. But like Anthony, what I want us to be able to do is to find, and Vladimir Lenin used to say an amazingly sort of apposite thing: agitation is a dialogue with the working class. Now, we have a dialogue with a lot more than the working class. We've got estate dwelling, very, very dislocated people. We've got the middle, the classic Brookside Close type place that you're canvassing in an election. And we've got the networked individuals, the young. There's got to be a story that gives them all a stake in a future. Now, I think that's not a PR job, and it's not a pure policy job. It's about being able to almost like have the policies, focus them, and get them validated almost in advance by people who don't really particularly like us, in the sense of winning an ideological, to use, we're in a university, academic word, hegemonic project that people start to say, you know what Labour are going to do is not only sounds brilliant, but even these sort of quite centrist academics say it's possible because it's been done before and it's been done elsewhere. I mean, the Nordic childcare model is a good example. I mean, I think that story, but then there is a PR job, which is got to be turned into monosyllabic, Anglo-Saxon, Orwellian, in a good sense, prose. Orwell used to say he used plain words, and it is, I wanted to say at the last election, your kid will go to university and Facebook, Google and Amazon will pay for it. Or your toddler will go get a free nursery place and, Facebook, Google, or whoever it is, the rich, the people with their money offshore, Amber Rudd, will pay for it. We've got to be a lot more, in this sense, you've got to learn from the populism of the right. Yep. Absolutely, unashamedly learn from them.
I mean, all that's music to my ears in one sense, but I think the question of telling, I mean, a word like hegemony, monarchy, this is a perfectly understandable and it's a good word. It may not be Anglo-Saxon, but it means how to rule and how to dominate, not by force, but through ideas and the power of argument and the power of belief and hope, as you put it in your. But this then moves you to the question of Scotland, and what do we do about, this argument here would be very different if we were north of the border. We can't just assume that we're all, the English thing of talking about us English, and we're actually talking about Britain and saying that, there is Northern Ireland. And we have to think that in the next 5 years, there could be a Sinn Féin government in Northern Ireland. They're very close electorally. And if you get if there's a long-term Tory carry on in government for the next 3 or 4 years, you could have a situation where the Northern Ireland wants to, they have the right by treaty to join the South. So, and how can you respond to those questions if you back off dealing with the very profound sort of national issues which then relate into the whole questions of migration and who we are as a country. So I think that, and that, the telling that, if you try to tell the socio-economic story around the tangibles, turning the argument against neoliberalism into the tangible outcome to communicate it, you still have got the other intangibles, which are the national and the democratic question, and they are integrated.
Anthony, just people talk a lot about the things like the media or the financial markets being hostile, etc., or even the EU being a barrier to some change. To what extent do you think that the British state, i.e. the apparatus, the civil service, etc., is potentially also, is that also a real challenge?
Well, I've been talking to quite a lot of Labour people, and I'm very struck that when they talk about the EU, this is the ones who are sort of tending towards Brexit, they see the undemocratic nature of the European Union, fair enough. They see the way that neoliberal rules and regulations are built into it, and they regard it as unchanging, whereas this is this You know, you've just had Macron denouncing the whole Lisbon, the legitimacy of the entire Lisbon and constitutional process. And the European Union, I am a great critic of its lack of democracy and its neoliberal character, but it's young, it's moving, and there are lots of different allies. And the British state has been there flexibly making, you know, reproducing its own capitalist nature for 200 to 300 years. And it's a much more formidable and embedded sort of apparatus than the European Union. And that's why my view on the European Union is the opportunities that open up working in solidarity with other Europeans on the left is great. And I don't think that Paul's programme could really work in one country.
Johnna, in terms of the how, so we talked about the what, but fundamentally, in terms of the different elements of the very different parts of the electorate that we talked about, do you think that can be bridged? As Paul says, is it about getting the narrative right? Is it about getting the story right? And is that one below? Or are there other elements that you think we really need to be touching on?
Well, I do think, I mean, especially with regards to debt, the story there is really the only game in town, because what is becoming increasingly clear is that the politicians and the elites know really nothing about banking and how money is made, and what has happened in the era of digitization. You know, the way that banking actually operates. I mean, it's really quite sad that, you know, most people in charge of running this country believe that banks take savings from some people and lend out multiples to others. I mean, that hasn't been banking for almost 75 years, but certainly nothing like the past 30 years. So I think for me, the how, which is much more, you know, I operate on a much more sort of everyday economic level than the kind of big, you know, thinking about the future of liberalism. But on the kind of everyday economics, I think the how is about, and from my opinion, about cancelling debt, household level debt cancellation, in which we take quantitative easing and we take bank bailouts and all that money that's been dedicated to supporting the profits of huge multinational firms, and instead distributing it amongst the population to create the kind of rising tide that floats all boats. That all those that have had to borrow in order to keep the economy going are then given relief from the public purse to actually revitalize growth. Student loans, credit card, home equity loans, just the huge array, just the endless number of loan products that have been pushed onto the public in order to keep British capitalism going for definitely the past 10 years, but arguably 30 years. That the growth has come by just creating more and more debt. To end that now with a kind of comprehensive package of cancelling these debt products, bailing out the households, and saying, you know, isn't it amazing that these great neoliberals, every single one of them, never once refused a handout from the government. These great free marketeers never said, actually, I believe in the free market. I'm a capitalist. I won't take your £100 billion bailout. That, you know, we call hypocrisy in its face and say, actually, we're going to take all that money we were going to give the banks that not a single Tory complained about, or the Institute for Economic Affairs, and we're going to take all that money and we're going to instead invest it in households and cancelling the debts that in the end were already bailed out 10 years ago with the financial crisis, and use those kind of real material means at our disposal to change people's outlook.
Faiza, you mentioned earlier on the kind of the narrative that's still there about not being able to afford things and all that kind of stuff. And we had, of course, George Osborne was the master of many ways of his phrases about fixing before the sun shone, about maxing the credit card and all that kind of, these kind of easy analogies that have quite a powerful framing on people's conception, really, and receptiveness to certain economic ideas. Do you think there is, I mean, to me it seems that the narrative has shifted, and I think Labour under Corbyn have done a good job of shifting the narrative towards investment. Do you think there's still a bit of a job to do, though, in terms of how we're speaking about how we're speaking about the economy, to get away from that very sort of narrow way of the economy is like a household and all this kind of stuff, which still actually holds quite a lot of sway with large parts of the population, as being quite a big barrier actually to pursuing some of the kind of objectives that we're talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about, a reset in terms of the debt, the household debt. How does that work when we still have an economy reliant on consumption, when people's personal beliefs about themselves and confidence is about them spending money and having the right things, right? So you need to do that, and I totally agree, but you need to do that alongside, changing what we're aiming for ultimately. So there is, and changing that in people's day-to-day lives. So like you say, a caring economy, shifting what it is that we want people to aim for. We're not asking you to just carry on spending, right? What are we asking for? And so I think there is a huge way to go in how we articulate a new economy and what the ultimate aims are. So, what do we replace GDP with in terms of measures? I think there's a whole thing there about, the different measures we have. And we should start talking about those now. Like Corbyn and McDonnell should have, these are the 3 measures we're going to use instead, and they should just start talking about them, and we should start talking about them. And we do need, whilst a lot of economists agree, for instance, that austerity was economic stupidity, just bad economics through and through, we just don't have as many people that come out and say that again and again, and say that in a way that people understand. And like you say, that powerful framing that people can emotionally connect with, because all that has happened there is that they've connected with their personal anxiety about their debts, which are very real, their household debts, to the wider economy. And so they get scared of the public debt, and they can't be honest about their own debt, because no one wants to be honest about how much credit card debt they've got. So there is a huge shift to happen there, but I do think that people are recognizing that this is a bit of a con. Like there's something here that doesn't add up. You told me this 10 years ago or 8 years ago, and where are we now? And things aren't still good, and we're still paying the price for the financial crisis when the bankers went back to getting their bonuses like a few years later. And we have to again and again point out how the system has failed.
And none of them went to jail.
And that's partly why the trust is not there as well, right? So
forget that, they've actually never had it so good. I mean, as of right now, as of today, and the 10 years since the financial crisis, the financial services sector in this country has never had it as good. That crisis was an absolute payday for them. It literally rained money since then. And it all got moved offshore. Well, the rest of us had to take cuts in pay, cuts in services. I myself just the other day had a woman from my neighborhood from dementia wandering in the freezing cold without a coat, had to come into my house. We called 999. The police were begging me could you take her, because I got emergency calls to take. All of us in the community rally behind to help this woman. We all have to take a cut, and there's not a single banker that didn't get a bonus.
And yet today people are more likely to blame immigration than they are the bankers, right? I mean, this is the scale of injustice and how kind of the wrong way we've gone, really. Yeah.
I wonder whether, so this year actually we've got, this summer 10 years since the financial crisis, whether that's a bit of a leverage point that we can use to kind of raise some of these issues. I want to just give the final point to Paul, and maybe you want to pick up some of Anthony's challenges, but also maybe a bit of thoughts about what you're going to be thinking about in the next sort of series of essays.
Well, I mean, this question of, so in my book, Post-Capitalism, I actually wrote almost in the first sentence, either we abandon neoliberalism or globalization will break apart. Now, I think that's begun. And it's both, there is both an overt break in globalization. I mean, Trump, America first. China has decided to really burst out into the international economy and create a mini empire. That's also a breaking up of globalization, if you think about it. You've got the balkanization of the internet, the balkanization of encryption standards, human rights falling apart, so Turkey, America itself retreating. These to me are the multifaceted symptoms of a retreat from globalization. Of course, what still exists is the global finance system, but even it is reconfigured around the new centers of power and growth. Now, in that situation, we shan't say globalization is dead, forget about it, it's not. But you have to recognize if your trench gets overrun, and using trench warfare analogy, if your trench gets overrun, no matter how attached you were to the trench, it's a suicide to stay in it. For me, you have to move to the next trench and defend that. And so what I mean by that analogy is that there are aspects of Labour's, that the trench being overrun was losing the referendum. We didn't win. It's not likely we're going to want to impose, for me, reversal of Brexit. We're going to try and do a socially just, minimal version, soft version of Brexit. Once you've done that, you've then got to say some of Labour's programme has to be focused around what it is doing in one country. Yeah, absolutely. Not proactively. I'm not in favour of saying you walk away from the single market because it makes your state investment programme easier, but you do want to do your state investment programme. And what haunts me is the experience of the 30s, the zero-sum game, that as we know, the countries that carried on playing the old game of pre-globalization, globalization, long after it ceased to deliver anything, were the ones that went the most extremely awry. So America suffers the deepest depression, Germany goes fascist. Britain comes off gold first, i.e. walks away from the global gold standard. It devalues, it prints money, and it builds houses on a mass scale. Now that wasn't socialism, but Baldwin, I think, effectively did, Baldwin and MacDonald did, by doing this, save Britain from the worst outcomes of the 1930s. And it's a mind bender. There's an even ruder word for it, but there is a mind bender for this generation to think that a left government may have to do some of that. But I don't flinch from it. I would, and in fact, in a weird way, it might solve some of the problems of what's our national destiny. Our national destiny might be to survive as a democratic country as one after the other not very democratic countries fall over. And when you say this to young people, they'll look at you, what are you crazy? But the experience of the 30s was that up until 1929, nobody really thought anything bad could happen. And then 4 years later, it's Palookaville in terms of democracy. And so to finish, because I am supposed to finish here, I'll say in the future, I do want to look at that, the aspect of how do you construct a consensus around a radical left economic programme and a sort of place in the world programme that to me has far more in common with traditional Labourism. I keep describing myself as a neo-Bevanite because Nye actually did want far left economics, but in the end he did, much to his own self-disgust, vote for nuclear weapons and indeed remained a supporter of what you might call quite a traditional, you could even call it, if you want to, imperialist Labour policy in terms of foreign policy. So I am going to try and pull out some of that, and it's the bit of my thinking that makes me not as popular possibly as other left thinkers among that kind of quite left momentum critical theory type world. So yeah, I want to absolutely take head on how do we do some of this in the national interest.
Lots to think about. Brilliant, thanks very much.